Right, a very, very warm welcome to you all, and what an incredible occasion this is. Just a quick reminder, this session is being recorded, so please make sure that you stay on with us, and by staying on it means you consent to having been recorded. There is a chat function. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your reflections, and potentially any questions you might have for Pete. If any of you know about the world of EFC, there's an incredible character there by the name of Bruce Buffer. He's quite an extraordinary character, and he does all the announcing for the championship fights. And he always starts off by saying, ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment you have all been waiting for. And I guess this has been 10 years in the waiting and 60 years in the living. A warm welcome to all the participants we've got Singapore, Denmark, Finland, the UK, Netherlands, the USA, Egypt, and South Africa. And it really is spectacular to have you with us. My name is Steve Hall, and it's a wonderful privilege to be able to introduce Leading with Humanity and Pete Leyburn. Today, we do have a man with us who needs absolutely no introduction. Pete, you have been the very epitome of the book about which you write. People are here because we love you, we respect you, and we admire you. You have an extraordinary abundance. You've always led with great authenticity. And I guess I join on behalf of everybody on this platform to thank you for the role that you've played in our lives. This book, I think, will be the testimony to many more wonderful opportunities for us to engage with you and your thinking and your Socratic wisdom. Now, I've had the real privilege of having a sneak preview into your book, Pete. And you have taken us on an extraordinary ride along the twists and turns of the Sisyphus branch, which has become so special to us. I found it both astounding and simple, thought-provoking and obvious, but above all, incredibly authentic, much like yourself. You've taken us on a roller coaster ride from Augsburger to Zander, from Beck to Blanchard to Bennis to Buffett, from Huffington to Hobbes, and from Frankel to Fromm, and from back to Ford, from Maxwell to Marx, and even from Margaret Wheaton to Renius and Schlongel. But really the magic, Pete, comes from you, and the way you've integrated the thoughts, the wisdom, the discussion points from all these extraordinary thinkers is your magic, and you've weaved it in for the last 10 years. And so my first question to you, Pete, is why this book? Apart from the fact you've had many family members, delegates, clients who begged you and coerced you and encouraged you to write this book, but why now? And why the book?
Steve, wow, thank you firstly for that very warm, generous introduction, and thank you to everybody who's signed up today. It's just wonderful to see you all. Many of you, I think I know most of you, but many of you have been past delegates on Leading with Humanity, and for those who haven't, well, you have got something to look forward to, hopefully one day. Steve, why the book and why at this time? Well, you're right. There has been a lot of demand over the last 10, 12 years from delegates to say, where is the book that goes with the program or retreat? And as you know, I've had many false starts over the years. But I think actually maybe the timing now is right. And there's a reason why it took so long to get to completion. I think there's a realization throughout the world that the systems or the frameworks or the models that we have in the world today are just not fit for purpose anymore. Some would say they're broken. I think the simple view is that maybe they're frameworks developed in a past era in what is termed a modern world that are struggling to be fit for purpose in a postmodern world. The world has moved from being complicated to being hugely complex. And it's this complexity that I think is creating challenges for us all in terms of how do we deal with it. There's just so many things going on, and so many best laid plans, are great until they meet the market or meet enemy, as General Stanley McChrystal so often said. The old command and control kind of culture that worked so well in the modern era is just not fit for purpose. It's ineffective. And so it's in that kind of context that I think we really do need to rethink our context. We need to rethink how we interpret what's going on in the world. Understand a little bit better why things are the way they are. We need to understand how the world of work is shifting and changing. And we need to understand how what leadership might be appropriate in a world that is so complex and changing so rapidly. And it's those sort of thoughts that really form the basis of the book and my thinking.
Fabulous, Pete. Thank you. And I know both of us are very keen Simon Sinek fans, and I think he puts a beautiful slant onto this where he says we need to dispel the language now that it was hard skills and soft skills. It's now hard skills and human skills. And I guess a lot of your book is really about that. How do we become truly more human in this process? And is this not the time for that right now in the world in which we live? But Pete, you mentioned about rethinking, and it got me thinking as to why not reimagine? What is it about rethinking? Your book takes us through a wonderfully weaved pattern of rethinking. And I was just questioning to myself as to why is this not about reimagining a new way of leadership?
Steve, I don't think we need to reinvent anything. I think that we just got to rethink, because the answers, I believe, are all around us. They're glaringly obvious and they're available for all to see if we choose to look and see. And then I think that word see is the operative word here, because I think it was Marcel Proust who said that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in getting new eyes. And I think that we just need to rethink the way we view the world. You know, I think it was early 60s that a legendary book written by a gentleman, Thomas Kuhn, came out called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in it, he introduced us to the concept of a paradigm and paradigm shifts. And paradigm is a framework, a mental model. And they're important because they give us a way of interpreting our world and what's around us. And I think that that's the real challenge that we face, is that our paradigms become very boxed. And the way we see the world becomes the only way to interpret the world. And that, I think, is we're finding great difficulty today, because there's so many different people coming with so many different perspectives of how to view the world. And what the whole notion of a paradigm is, that it's something that is that mental map that is shaped by our upbringing, our culture, our family, our education, our friendship circles, media, our faith, our religious beliefs, the culture we're in, what we watch. But these beliefs or assumptions become fundamental in how we interpret what's going on around us. And that's what we call our see. Covey would call it a see. That's what we see. And we act off the basis of what we see. So if I think, simple example, if I think South Africa is a no-hope place to live, there's no opportunity here, I will act in a way that exhibits that, okay? If I think that, let me just think, all people of a different faith to me are wrong, I will act in that way. So the see creates what we do. The do, in turn, begets a result, which is what we get. Because we get what we get because we do what we do. And we do what we do because we see what we see. And if the do then reconfirms what we see, it's the basis of habits. That's Covey, from years back. So then we got into a habit of seeing the world in a way, acting in a way, which results in the same old responses that we get. And we get, you see, things aren't working. Why? Because, South Africa's broken or the world's broken. A simple thing is, if you go to the US, you have two different views. Depends if you see Fox or you see CNN. Gives you two different perspectives of the same place. So that's the framework. Now, I think that the challenge we've had is we've been in a world, in the modern world, which is circa the last 300 years. We've been so concerned with what we do, action results, performance. And everything has been focused on do. Even all leadership development, and we know that leadership development depends on which research you follow, but it's somewhere north of 60 billion US a year. Okay, and here's the catch, with a less than 2% ROI. Now go figure. If you're spending 60 billion with a less than 2% return on investment, something's wrong in this process. And I think that the fundamental challenge is because we have focused on trying to get everybody to do things. People look around us and say, so what's the answer? How do we fix this? What do we do? And to me, that's the wrong way of addressing it. The way we're going to fix things or look at things is to change how we see the world, how we see what's going on around us, how we see the abundance of opportunities and role models that we have all around us to give us a way of interpreting the world as we see it today. So that's the notion of rethinking. I don't think we have to reinvent anything.
Thank you, Pete. Can I just remind everybody just to stay on mute for now? There will be potentially some time for questions, and please make generous use of that chat function. Pete loves a conversation, and if it's a conversation. So Gary, I wonder if you could just please go on to mute, or next perhaps use your power. Gary. A lot of background noise there, Gary. Or Khari, is it Khari? Khari Dombo. Thanks, guys. Pete, yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that notion of see, do, get is certainly central to so much of your thinking. And I remember one of our magnificent mentors to both of us is the indomitable Mick Finn, who said that the word creation and reaction are all exactly the same letters. And it depends on how we use the C. Where do we put the C from reaction to creation? And I guess so much of what we do is dependent on the way we see the world. I certainly have been quite guilty in my training industry of focusing on people's behaviors as opposed to their pictures. What is it, the fundamental belief system or the paradigm which causes the behavior? And if we could tackle that, and I believe your book really does tackle that with many magnificent anecdotes that have actually been around for some time. So I get the point that it's now more about rethinking as opposed to we have to start with a blank page. There have been many answers. There are great anecdotes in your book, stories, case studies, and exceptional models, which give us a part of the answer. I think I'm always encouraged by the words of Rainer Maria Rilke, that wonderful poet who says, live your questions now, live your questions now, and then someday, maybe far into the future without even realizing it, we will live ourselves into our own answers. And what I got from your book is that it is about our answers. It's about who are we being, not necessarily about what are we doing. But Pete, there's a quote in your book which is very special to both of us. It comes from the work of Edward Teller. And it goes something like, when I reach the edge of all the light in my life and I step into the darkness beyond, I must find one of two things in place. And Nick's, thank you, you've put that up right on cue. But maybe, Pete, speak to us a little bit about the meaning of that quote for you and why it's quite central to some of your thinking in the book.
Yeah, Steve, this is the more I spend time with this quote, the more it is just central to my own life and to all the work we do. I think that for many people, there might be dark times ahead, or they might see, wow, I just don't understand what's going on in the world. It's just too complex. It's just too challenging. And, you know, it's doom and gloom. And really, where is the opportunity? And that's where it comes to that if we reach that kind of boundary of saying, well, wow, I just don't know where things are going. I don't know what's going to happen. How are we going to survive this? Where to here in this country, elsewhere in the world? That we have either one of two things. Either that we're given something solid to stand on. Now, let me just dwell on that one for the moment. I think many people today feel that they're on shifting sands because the existing paradigm that they built their lives on, they built their thinking on, is being challenged. And as we know, a paradigm shift simply implies that we are rendered foundationless because the assumptions that we've used to look at anything have been shifted, okay? And wow, if we've had an experience of it, it's what COVID has done over the last 18 months to some extent. But I think where we've gone in the past is we've looked to an external environment that to find that something firm to stand on. We've gone to look for other things outside of ourselves to find what we should bank ourselves on. Is it a qualification? Is it a degree? Is it financial resources? Those sort of things have really driven us in the past. And I believe that's shifting in today's world because the external environment is so unpredictable, is so volatile and complex, that if we look for solutions external to ourselves, we won't find them. And I believe that something solid we've got to learn to stand on is our own sense of purpose, our own sense of meaning, in the sense of asking the question, well, who am I? Who do I want to be in this world that is so unbelievably complex and just escalatingly difficult to understand and to deal with? And so coming back to our own sense of why am I here? What's this all about? Who am I? And that depth of self-awareness that seldom people give themselves the time to do, to really say, this is who I am. This is how I want to show up in the world. And then I don't have to play roles, or I don't have to try and fit into circumstances or situations, because if we try and do that, it's just going to get so complex because there's just so many different things, all of which are shifting and moving at speed. So we need to come back to a tremendous sense of who am I? Who do I want to be? And as we often say to our delegates, write your CV forward. Don't tell me what you're going to do in life. I want to know who you want to be in life. Who you want to be in life, because that, irrespective of what you do, will stand strong, firm. And it's great that I think so many people live their life as schizophrenics. We're one person at the office, one person at home, one person at church, one person at our golf club, whatever it might be. We need to get ourselves strong and solid on who we are, who we choose to be. So that's the something firm to stand on. The second part of it, or you would have been taught to fly. There's a wonderful old yarn about geese in a yard, and it was a walled yard, and they were happy in living there because they were fed and they were happy. And then a goose from outside came in and said, wow, guys, there's a wonderful world outside. And these geese in the yard wouldn't fly because they said, no, we can't fit here. And it was all good until the food ran out, until the yard became unsustainable. But they didn't have the courage to spread their wings and fly, to go outside of the walls of the confinement and to fly and go and explore and see what's out there. Now, with that little parable or analogy, I think all of us to some extent sit with what I call our circle of certainty. We live within our circle of comfort, and we're all creatures of comfort. We're all creatures of habit. We have that circle of comfort. We say we're happy operating in this space. And then what happens? Someone comes along and says, no, go outside. And we are risk averse to go and explore and to go into different areas and to do different things. I think the last 2 years of COVID has forced many of us to go and do things that we would ordinarily never have done. I mean, this launch, who thought 2 years ago you'd do a launch to people in 8 or 9 different countries all over the world, sitting, online. But I think one of the big things we are going to have to learn to do is to leave our circle of comfort, to explore, to go outside our comfort zones, and to taste a world that is different. And those of you who've been on Leading with Humanity know that's something that we introduce you to. We take you out of your circle of certainty. We take you out of your comfort zone and put you into things. And you say, wow, this is amazing. I just never knew. And I think so often we feed our mind with thoughts and ideas that confirm our old prejudices, our old assumptions, that we don't give ourselves a chance to go out and explore. So why this quote is particularly thing is that I hope and pray that this book gives you both something solid to stand on in the years to come, and also will give you some ideas of how you can fly.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, Pete. And I know that we are very much united in a belief that says, I don't have a corporate job, or I'm not a leader in my community, or I'm not a team leader. And yet parents, mothers in particular, play this extraordinarily ambiguous role of providing a solid foundation and helping their children to fly. And when moms get it right, it is an extraordinary balance to watch. It's much like that beautiful flocking metaphor that you talk about in your book. I guess we've been guilty, though, in many ways of looking at competency models as firm rocks on which to stand. And we've got into that habit, haven't we?
Oh, don't get me started. I guess you have got me started on this, but you know, the competency model that organizations just love was obsolete 40, 50 years ago. And yet, I don't know what it is. And you can see I'm already getting going on this. It's an obsession that organizations have. We got to, well, here are the 5 steps to leadership. These are the leadership competencies. And these are the 5 ways or the 7 ways or the irrefutable laws that come up with. And I want to say, I don't know how strongly I can say it, but it is a curse, I think, for people, because how dare organizations tell us how we've got to behave or who we've got to be in order to be a leader. And so, you know, to me, leadership, and next, maybe you want to just toss up 7 thoughts that I just want to share so that you can catch them, because leadership is a state of being. It's not a state of doing. You don't wake up in the morning, go to the office and turn on leadership. It's an embodiment of who we are. And if anybody comes along and says, you've got to do this, this, and this in order to be deemed a leader, you know, abuse them, reject them, because it's just inappropriate. How dare people tell you who you've got to be in order to be a leader? And I think that our obsession and why leadership development programs have failed so dismally is they focused on leadership as a state of doing. And the question I would ask everybody who's on this webinar is, do you live your life as a human doing, or do you live your life as a human being? And I think big organizations want us to live our lives as human doings. They want us to be vehicles of production, you know, as opposed to being yourself at the office. And we've got to find organizations that celebrate you for being authentically yourself. And the difficulty here is that so many of us didn't spend time actually saying, well, who are we? And it comes back to that something firm to stand on. So the first point I'd say is we've got to really fight hard against people prescribing what it is to be a leader. I'm going to jump straight to number 6 here, because leadership comes in multiple forms. And you talked about mothers, but I think school teachers are extraordinary leaders. I think people, nurses are extraordinary leaders. People in social welfare are extraordinary leaders. People with no titles, but do amazing things. I often ask delegates the question, how great a leader was Shakespeare's English teacher? Now, we don't know who he or her was, or Einstein's maths teacher. But do we give credit to Madiba's mother for the role she played, or members of that community in influencing and helping him grow up to be the person he was? So leadership, you cannot say this is only one way to lead. There are multiple. There's as many ways to lead as there are people on this planet. Because if you think about it, if we are being authentically ourselves, we lead out of who we are. To point 3, we influence out of who we are. And it's not a command and control thing, it's influence. Why should other people, actually follow you? Now, again, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping around on these 7, but they're so intertwined that they just are. If I want to influence somebody, I've got to connect to them. And leadership can't be aloof. We have to connect. We have to be in touch. We have to really get to grips with the people around. And one of the key things about that is we've got to learn to listen, and not listen with the intention of answering, but listening with the intent to understand where those we want to connect with are. What is their paradigm? How are they seeing things? And how do we then have the ability to influence them through our thinking, our actions, or whatever else it might be, or just simply influencing by who we're being, how we're showing up, how we don't respond to situations that are uncomfortable or difficult. It's the fourth thing we need to understand there is that leaders influence, but the followers actually do the changing of things. If we want to change something, a leader can have 101 ideas, but unless the followers buy in, chances are nothing's going to change. And so the notion of followership and building the ability for followers to want to be influenced is really important. And it talks to things like, be careful of manipulative leadership or leadership for your one's own agenda, because followers see through these things extraordinarily quickly. And so authentic, genuine leadership is to be consistently who you are. That comes back to state of being. And then followers can buy in to the fact this is who you are, and hopefully your technical competence as well give them credence to say, wow, back this person, because I really think that they are worthy of following. The number 5, leaders give continuously. Yeah, leadership is a state of giving. It's not a state of taking. This has been written about numerous, in so many different formats in the notion of servant leadership. But I think this, just a simple thought that leaders give encouragement. And Napoleon said it, leaders are dealers in hope. Leaders give ideas, leaders give opportunity, leaders give time, leaders give space, they give feedback. And if you think about all the worst managers you may have had the misfortune of working with, they took all those things, they took your time, they took your ideas. So this notion of giving, and I don't mean in a financial sense, giving of yourself, giving of the space and opportunity for others is a fundamental part of leadership. And the last one there is leadership is a choice. This is going to sound a little bit controversial, but I'm happy. The age-old question, are leaders born or are they made? Well, the answer pedantically is yes. Are they born or are they made? Yes. If you think of leadership as a state, it is about influence. I often say to ladies on our programs, particularly those who have the privilege of being mothers, to what extent did your unborn child influence your behavior while you were pregnant? And invariably they will say, big time. Of course they did. And so my response is, well, it goes to show that nobody is born genetically encoded not to lead. Let me say it again. No one's born genetically encoded not to lead. The fact that less than 5% of the world, the research is saying, is standing up and leading is a factor of choice. For most people, it's easier to not take on the risk of leadership because it's never their fault then. It's, it's not my problem. It's other people. I'll go with the flow. And that is the challenge, is that leadership is a choice that we must either choose to say, I want to lead, or I don't want to lead. Now, one of the challenges here is because of the business world, political world, military world, particularly, that has created these templates of what leadership is. So many people don't think they're a leader. And I've heard it so many times, but I'm not a leader. And it's nonsense. It's a choice. You may lead in a very different way. You may lead in as you said earlier, mothers are an incredibly powerful role. Siblings can be incredibly powerful leaders and influence. So in so many different ways, and that's the point, leadership comes in multiple forms, and we need to understand that if we're being authentically ourselves, we can lead, influence, and give continuously out of who we are.
Yeah. Pete, thank you. Your book, again, takes us through this extraordinary Sisyphus branch of twists and turns, of great thinkers, of great anecdotes, of great stories and great case studies. But all the way through, you weave these magnificent leadership thoughts through, not as competency models, but simply as thoughts. And I think what you've done here is you've been able to work through the complexity of this thing called leadership and come to an elegant simplicity on the other side. I'm so glad I asked the question. It clearly touched a nerve about competency models, and I can alert you to the chat group. It's come alive with encouragement, with don't hold back, Pete. This is pure gold. Incredible way to explain leadership. It's astounding how obvious what you're saying is. It's magic stuff, Pete. And it really is magic stuff, and yet you will be the first one to attest that it's not yours. You've simply just integrated the thoughts into a magnificent package. In that process, and going through those 7 leadership thoughts, you've referenced some extraordinary people. That leadership comes in multiple shapes and forms. The likes of Mamkani, the likes of Marufilwe, the likes of the magnificent Blessing, who is the epitome of these leadership thoughts. And you always constantly come back to some things we could think about that may act or enable us to act. It's not about what we do, it's about who we are. But at times, we need to act as well. One of those is around listening, and one of the quotes you use, I think, comes from David Augsburger, which is, and Sue and Lindsay and all the magnificent neuroscientists who are part of this webinar will probably correct me, but the act of being listened to is so close to the feeling of being loved that the average brain cannot tell the difference. And so constantly you weave these stories. I guess you will also attest to the fact that the VUCA world that everybody talks about, right? This VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world is actually not new either. It was pretty VUCA in the Second World War and the First World War. It was very volatile at the time of the Great Depression, and the British were a bit uncertain about the Zulus in the 1870s. So it's not new, but maybe what is new is it's exponential now. It's an e-VUCA world. It's just happening at such a fast pace. I love the thought you posed about us being schizophrenic. You know, if I've got to be one person at the golf course and one person as a father and a totally different person as the leader of a financial organization and another one as a soccer coach, and then the person who tells the best jokes in the pub, it takes an extraordinary amount of energy to wake up all 7 people inside the same body. And I really love that thought. Again, to all of you, thank you for your comments on the chat group. By all means, if there are questions that start to emerge, we will certainly be moving into a place, I hope, where we can ask some questions. We will close before to make sure that those of you who have to drop off can do so with pleasure and with grace, but we'll also be around for a few minutes afterwards, should you want to continue the discussion. Pete, towards the end of your book, you talk about rethinking organizations. And I found there to be some absolutely fascinating ways that each of us might not only rethink our own organizations, but even our role in those organizations. You speak beautifully about Wiseman's Car Wash in KwaMashu. You speak beautifully about jazz bands and the Protean organizations. And so maybe you'd like to just cast some thoughts for us on your thinking in those realms.
Yeah, Steve. Again, this goes back many years. People have been telling us that the organizational model, and if anyone is misunderstanding, if any of you ever draw an organogram in a pyramid form, you're stuck in a modern world. You're stuck last century. It's predicated by Taylorism, which is a 100-year-old kind of scientific management process. So let me not go there because that will also get me going. I think that we really need to completely rethink the way organizations operate. As I say, the writers have been talking about this, and I mean, the most prolific one of them all, probably Tom Peters, has been writing since early 80s about this. And he gets more in his latest book, Extreme Humanism, which he calls it, as they say, is a rant, because he says just people aren't listening. You know, as much as our organizations are just not serviceable, people continue operating the same way. And I find it fascinating, by the by, that both two of the iconic organizations of the last 50 years, being GE, General Electric, and Johnson & Johnson, have both decided to start unbundling because it's just too big and too unwieldy. And frankly, The moment people become a number in a system, it's too big. It's too big. So I think there are two things, before I get into those models that I want to shape, the two things that become really mission critical for organizations to grasp. One is to understand the role of culture. And the model, the analogy I use in the book is actually the biblical parable of the sower and the seed. And I say, just think about all the great people in your organization as talent seeds. And you put them into the soil that is your company culture. And then we wonder why they don't flourish. Is it the people that are wrong, or is it the soil that's wrong? And the whole notion of understanding the soil that is your company culture, that you want this organization and the people to flourish in. Just sit with that metaphor in your head about culture. But the critical importance of being very strong about building a culture that is just so important and vibrant that people can tap into, that the culture that allows me to be who I want to be. And for somebody else who wants to be somebody else, that's fine. The culture may not fit. But if we don't understand, and it's tough in an environment where we are so desperate to bring in the right people technically and for socio reasons, it's a difficult challenge, particularly in a country like South Africa. The second thing is to understand that strategy is not a path to the future. It's a GPS coordinate of where we need to get to. And I talk about a field of play in the book. And the field of play says that we've got to give those talented people in our organization space to express themselves in pursuit of organization goals, as opposed to try and box things down with rigidity and rules and regulations. So those two predicate the third part, which is to say, well, how might we think of organizations differently? The first model, it probably is to think, how many of you operate with a computer system that's still an old traditional A-frame, where everything has to be routed through a central server, if you like? And the answer is no one. I mean, that went out 20, 30 years ago. Yet we still run our organizations the same way. Okay. The operating model in the information world is a network. So how do we start thinking of organizations as networks? Far stronger thing than structures. Network, where everyone has access to all information from everyone else and people can operate. So the network is a very strong, and it's allowing different people to fit in. There's no kind of bureaucracy or walls or silos that come through it. The second model, which you alluded to, is I think so many of the traditional organizations could be akin to a symphony orchestra. You have a person who developed a score, so some great composer, and the only thing that is subject to interpretation may well be the conductor's interpretation of that score. But by and large, those very competent members of the orchestra sit usually in a fairly set area, because it's all understood for acoustics reasons that certain people sit in certain areas, and they play the notes as prescribed. And they make great music. They make great music, but the interpretation is limited pretty much in the hand of the conductor. I think that's where organizations last century flourished. But I'd like to offer a thought that we rather think in terms of jazz bands. Now, I love the notion of jazz bands. They say one piece of jazz is never played the same way again, because every time it's played, somebody's improvising, somebody's doing something. Now, if you think about jazz musicians, they typically are technically very competent. They know their instrument, they know how they do. But when they get together for a gig, it doesn't matter if all 150 or 100 in the orchestra are there. No one's going to be missing if they're not there. There's a gap, but the others fill in. And the music is played with just a slightly different interpretation. There is an incredible respect amongst the individual members. And Steve, you'll remember we sat in a jazz club in Copenhagen actually many years ago, spending a good half an hour debating who was the leader of this jazz band. And we couldn't work it out. And when we eventually decided, we were wrong because we'd got the wrong person. And it's this notion that different people lead at different times, and there's a respect that everybody else has time to lead. and to do their thing. And the others don't just abdicate. They say, well, I think there's a lovely term that one of the great jazz musicians says is our role as backup is to play into the spaces. So if you start to play with this metaphor of jazz bands, I think it's an extraordinary way of beginning to think how organizations might work. People say, but is there anything solid to stand on in a jazz band? Well, yes, there is. There will be the key we're playing in. There will be the tempo. And yeah, this is actually, we think this is the tune we're playing. Thereafter, the exploration and interpretation and the latitude to try and explore things becomes a really important thing. The third model that I talk about goes back, as many of my things do, go back to Greeks, back into the old Greek mythology. And there was a wonderful Greek god by the name of Proteus. And Proteus was the source of all wisdom, because he always had the answer or the solution to what you needed. But the difficulty was that Proteus was a very elusive fellow, because he could change form and shape at a drop of a hat. So you'd think he was a human and looking for him, but he'd turn himself into a dolphin. And then when you think, now he's either a human or a dolphin, he'd turn himself into an eagle. And then when you think he's that, then he's turned himself into a leopard. It could move. So he could change form at will. But the other thing about Proteus was his substance of who he was never changed. He was absolutely consistently the same. So who he was and what he was about didn't change, even though the format changed. Now, if you play with that model into an organization, you say, well, how do you allow different parts of the organization to adopt different shapes? They don't all have to be the same. They don't all have to be wholly owned. They don't all have to fit a framework. But if we are working together for a common purpose, with a common values, common culture, within a field of play, let it go. This obsession with control and trying to button things down is, as they say, just so last century. We've really got to push it forward a lot more. I then also go and talk about organizations as living organisms, to understand how living organisms work and operate together. We use examples of mass schools of sardines or mass birds of quellias in flight, to say, well, how do they work? I mean, there's no organization structure. There's no lead bird or lead sardine, but how do they operate? And there's a lot of work that we can find out in that whole space, to think about organizations as living dynamic organisms that are alive. They're not atrophying and dying.
Yeah, that's stunning, Pete. And that time in the Copenhagen jazz bar at the Vida Lum was certainly one of my Kairos moments. And for those of you unaware of a Kairos moment, come and join us on one of our Leading with Humanity weeks. You'll have many Kairos moments. These are moments which are truly unforgettable. The ancient Greeks wrote beautifully about not the quantity of time we spend, but the impact of that time. And what does it have on our relationships? What impact is it not just of the 20 minutes of quantifiable time, but on the exponential, non-linear, non-measurable impact of the relationships we have around us? And Pete, in so many ways, what I felt in your book was it's an opportunity to delve into some serious Kairos moments. This is way more than a book on leadership. This is a book about life and about how we lead our lives for best results. Pete, there have been some great questions. I know Darren might have had a hand up there. Rob was asking a question. How should a leader best go about teaching or inspiring others to lead or to see? That lovely word. So maybe you've got a response for Robert Millard on that one.
Okay, thanks, Rob, for that question. Well, the first thing I want to do is widely distance the word teach and leadership. I don't believe you can teach leadership, because teaching, you teach people how to do things. What we need to do is to help people to discover themselves and to build the self-awareness and self-confidence to be themselves out of who they are. That journey of self-discovery is a starting off point of, for us, any leadership growth and development. People come to us for a week's retreat, and we say, we're not going to teach you anything because we don't believe leadership can be taught. But you can learn how to lead through experiences, through things that challenge your paradigms, through things that begin to make you reconsider who you're being, or why is it that I'm reacting in a certain way. And that journey of self-discovery is one of the greatest ways we can learn to lead far more effectively. I am, let me be polite. I'm violently opposed to any boxed program that's trying to teach leadership, because it doesn't work. It's the do. It's the part of the 98% ROI that gets lost. So that inside out journey, it's a state of being, and to help people be who they ought to be who they were purposed to be, I think is the greatest role we can play to help grow leadership in anybody, whether it be our children, whether it be our grandchildren, whether it be our colleagues in the office, in our practice. I hope that helps, Rob. Thank you for nodding. Appreciate it.
No, good. You can see him on screen there. That's great, Pete. And again, the invitation is open. If there are any other questions, please feel free to put your hand up or pop them onto the chat group. It'll be lovely to hear from you. While you're thinking through that, Pete, in your book, you talk about the difference between asking your children, did you score a goal today? Or did you create an assist? And for me, that was a fundamental question that perhaps I've missed sometimes in my own parenting, is that I focused on the outcome. Did you score a goal today? Did you make a 50 today? Did you take 3 wickets today? Or what assist? What did you create for somebody else? Not did you win the game, but did you enjoy the process? Not to focus on the outcome, but to grapple with the process of the assist. And I think, Pete, this book is an assist. It's not going to focus on the outcomes. It's going to be an assist. So maybe just comment on that a little for me, because I love the anecdote and I love the analogy, and it made me reflect a little more about that.
Yeah, Steve, I think that I must admit, I get annoyed when I see all these awards of Businessman of the Year and so-and-so of the Year. And I think, well, did they get it for what they did or for who they were? Sadly, for most of them, it'll be for what they did and achieved. And I'm not detracting from the merit of what they may have done. Invariably, it's financial results for shareholders or something like that. But to me, I would love to see awards for people who they are. And to me, if our leadership journey is so that I get the glory, that's the wrong thing. It's what am I able, through who I'm being, able to evoke in others. I think that in many cases, we use the example as well of The Godfather. I don't think it's in the book, but we use it elsewhere, is that how many decisions, Godfather got all the glory, he was the top guy, but how many decisions did he make? The chances are not many, because it was a consigliere, all his advisors and those who worked around him, who were actually doing the thinking, but we don't know the names of the consigliere. And so this notion of putting people up in lights, I think, is scary, because it creates an egotism at its extreme. It creates narcissism. And we've seen too many of those leaders in the world recently. I think we need to understand that the role of the leader is to evoke possibility in others. And if we are able to generate that ability for others to flourish and fly, that's effective leadership. And so the simple analogy of the, I guess also for me, it's the narrative that we put into our children's heads. Is it about winning at all costs? Is it about you've got to score the goal, you've got to get the glory? Or is it about how significant was your contribution to the game we played? And that I think is important, that leaders of teams also recognize that if somebody in a cricket match didn't bat or didn't bowl, but just tried hard in the field, that's worthy of notice, because they contributed to the whole. And it's to understand that the hero is the collective. The hero is not the individual. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. I know there's one very, very passionate, bless him, very passionate New Zealand supporter on this particular platform. And he would say, well, it's interesting that in the All Black team, the team decides on who should join the team. It's not just the selectors. And one of the fundamental prepositions is, would they pass the ball to me for me to score the try? And therein lies the assist. And I guess, despite the fact that, Chad, sorry, we are number one at the moment, but one has to be honest, the New Zealanders have really shown us the way. And so much of their style has been about the assist. Is the person willing to be the assister as opposed to the top try scorer? And I think you make such beautiful reference to that throughout your book, Pete, whether it's about mothers, or whether it's about nurses, or whether it's about Shakespeare's English teacher or Einstein's maths teacher. I certainly remember driving differently when Hannah was about to be born. She influenced my behavior because I drove better in the traffic. I was far more aware. I stuck to the speed limits, and everybody else around me was just a chaos causer. And you keep making reference to these extraordinary anecdotes, Pete. And I found it, again, to just be the simplicity on the other side of complexity, which makes it an easy read, but a very significant read. There are more comments on the chat group. Thank you, Miles. And Miles has written the foreword to your book. And I think there's been an extraordinary relationship there, Pete, that the nature-nurture discussion leads us into people's personality and how that tends to be a key criteria for a propensity to lead. Back to your question, or at least your response, are leaders born or are they made? Well, yes, yes, they are. I know we've got a few more minutes left, and next it would be great to make sure that people at least had an idea of how to buy this extraordinary book. I think it's going to be a seminal book, not just on leadership, but on life. And in that time, while that slide comes up for all of you, please do feel free to engage any further in the discussion. You're welcome to come off mute, put your hand up, throw a question up for Pete. And Pete, if there aren't any right now, maybe you've got another thought to share for us from an anecdotal point of view, something in your book that you might feel people would really enjoy to think through.
So Steve, maybe there is one thing that I should note, and that is the incredible role that neuroscience has played in helping us navigate this way forward. You know, there's the old saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and that, gee, I'm too old for all of this. And it's, you know, and the wonder of neuroscience and what the last 10 years research has shown is that the brain is an amazing organism that can in fact rewire itself. And the whole concept of neuroplasticity. And I think that in one of the chapters I talk about, yes, we are creatures of habit, but we can rewire ourselves and we can change our thinking patterns. It doesn't matter how old we are. So when people say, well, I'm now 75 or I'm 80 and I'm too old, no, the answer is nonsense. You know, one of the great guys that I've always revered is Peter Drucker, who wrote his last Harvard Business Review article at the age of 93. And his thinking was as sharp and as contemporary as in any stage. So to me, age is a state of mind. And we need to be very careful we don't think ourselves old or unable to deal with what's going on. We are all abundantly able to do it, provided we learn to rewire. And I'm going to use an interesting word here. We rewire our brains, because whilst the brain and the head is a physical organ, neuroscience has also shown that in terms of neurotransmitters and impulses that shape how we do things, the heart and the gut are generating as many or similar amounts of of these neurotransmitters. So in essence, we could talk about having three brains: a head brain that drives our thinking and our curiosity, a heart brain which drives our compassion and empathy, and a gut brain that really drives our courage. Now, so anecdotally, how will I say that? Well, neuroscience shows that it's true to have your heart broken, because the neurotransmitters are actually causing a disjoint within your heart because something has saddened you or you're emotionally gutted about something. Similarly, people say, well, you don't have the guts for something. And that's true, because the courage from your gut brain is not coming through. So I believe that leadership going forward needs to embrace the three brains equally, and that a truly effective leader will constantly be curious and thinking with his head brain, have a tremendous degree of compassion and empathy with his or her heart brain, and be courageous and intentional from the gut brain in order to lead with courage, compassion, and curiosity.
Yeah, thank you, Pete, for sharing that. And I think maybe to Robert's question, how do we go about inspiring? Not teaching, as you said, it's not something we can teach, but certainly enable, encourage, help with, assist. And maybe one of those thoughts is that, it's okay to think with all the other brains, our gut brain, our heart brain, and our head brain. And in so doing, we will certainly have a broader perspective through which to change our paradigms, through which to look at life through another set of lenses. And so again, thank you very much for sharing that. We're nearing the end of our hour together. And again, the invitation is, if you need to drop off, you've got some information about Pete's book. I would strongly, strongly encourage you to order not just one, but a number of assists for other family members, key people in your organization, somebody that would have a kairos moment in the reading of this book. We will be staying on for a few more minutes. The recording will continue. So those of you that do need to drop off, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your energy. We thank you very much for your questions and your comments, and really for giving up your time to be with us today. Pete, you always remind me of a beautiful piece of writing written some 900 years ago, that when I was young and free and my imagination had no limits, I dreamed of changing the world. But as I grew older and wiser, I realized that the world would not change. So I shortened my sights somewhat and decided to change only my country. But it too seemed immovable, and as I grew into my twilight years, in one last desperate attempt, I settled for changing only my family, those closest to me. But alas, they would have none of it. And now, as I lie on my deathbed, I suddenly realize if I'd only changed myself first. By their example and encouragement, I may have been able to better my country and my family and my country. And who knows, I might even have changed the world. And so you take us all the way back through this book, through your thinking, through the 10 years of the writing of this book, and more so through the 60 plus years of living it as a magnificent example. So thank you, because it reminds us that we really need to think about these things from within. These are not a list of competencies that we can tick off and claim to be a leader, because it's an evolving world. It's moving much like Proteus, him or herself, through the chaos and excitement of the time in which we live. I'll certainly be thinking about how I might organize my family more as a jazz band, as opposed to a conductor who pretends to have all the answers and that everybody needs to step in line and do this and play this and keep quiet now and play more loudly there, but to enable their true selves to be in that family unit. And I guess that's where our leadership really starts, is with ourselves. So, Pete, thank you.